I'd like to thank Eva and Christine for bringing us all together to share our struggles and to be active in our optimism together. I'm, as was already introduced, I'm a small-scale livestock farmer of pigs and cattle and also of garlic. I'd like to pay my respect to the elders past and present of the people of the Jaja-Wurrung country on whose land we farm, land that has not been ceded. And we have chosen to pay the rent, as we say in Australia, so we pay 1% of our income to a local Indigenous organisation. I'm going to briefly point to what you've already heard about in these 2 days, some of the worst consequences of industrial agriculture, and then turn to something more hopeful and agroecological solutions. Next slide, please. Thank you. It's timely in this period of COVID to remind ourselves of the risks of loss of biodiversity in agriculture. The production of a constantly narrowing range of species and breeds of animals and plants is leading to greater risks in our food system. In the case of the rise of zoonoses like coronavirus, one of the most significant risks is from intensive livestock production. And I know my comrade Rob Wallace and Alex told you about this yesterday. And the expansion of industrial agriculture into remote areas of forest, giving rare pathogens new opportunities to access vulnerable hosts, giving rise to new and more virulent strains of influenza and coronaviruses, such as COVID-19. Some of the key risks posed by intensive livestock production, which would have already been mentioned by Rob Wallace and Alex Liebman yesterday, include the separation of breeding animals from farms where their offspring are raised and later harvested for food, and the narrowing of genetic resources to very few breeds of genetically similar animals that are then crowded into unhealthy conditions that suppress their immune systems. This creates what Rob calls food for flu. Next slide, please. While most of us have heard about regenerative agriculture in countries like Australia and the US, agroecology is much less known or understood in many global North countries. It's a science, a set of practices, and a social movement that fosters the democratic participation of farmers in the food system. I briefly mentioned the distinction between regenerative agriculture and agroecology to show that while both are working to recuperate ecosystems from centuries of colonial damage, but to also highlight that the agroecology movement is underpinned by notions of social and economic justice as well, putting solidarity with First Peoples first and solidarity economies that reject corporate power and capitalism next. Indigenous knowledges scholar Tyson Yunkaporta of the Appalach Clan of Far North Queensland says, "We rarely see global sustainability issues addressed using Indigenous perspectives and knowledges. It's always about the what and never about the how." There's an ancient custodial ethic amongst Indigenous peoples and peasants globally, and a growing one amongst agroecological and regenerative non-Indigenous farmers in the global North, stemming from place-based understandings of country, reactions to climate change and loss of biodiversity, and an increasing willingness to grapple with what it means to hold title to the unceded lands of First Peoples while working out local strategies to pay the rent. My position as a small-scale agroecological farmer, a local and global food sovereignty activist, and a scholar offers me a great deal of insight into the ways that farmers are embracing Indigenous knowledges, what barriers they face, and what researchers and policymakers can do to help support an agroecological transition as part of a broader set of strategies for climate adaptation, preservation of biodiversity, and the maintenance of functional ecosystems. Next slide, please. Indigenous peoples and peasants have known for thousands of years that humans are just one part of an ecosystem, and that when we take more than the system can give, it falls out of balance and degrades to the detriment of many, if not all, parts of the whole, including the human residents. Agroecological farmers favor strategies that mimic natural systems, that are flexible and can be adjusted and reevaluated over time. They aim to diversify production on farm, which creates resilience, enabling farms to adapt to climate change and economic challenges. At the core of agroecology is the idea that the type of farming undertaken must be appropriate for that particular environment. The aim is to design complex and diverse agroecosystems for all the individual parts to eventually support and sustain each other to prevent the outbreak of pests and diseases common in monocultural systems. In practice, this means incorporating a range of livestock, grains, plants in ways that minimize external inputs by reusing waste on farm, spreading out the risk of relying on just one crop, conserving water, and looking after the soil. Next slide, please. Agroecology nurtures life, including in the soil. By keeping soil covered with plants at all times, organic matter is constantly broken down into simpler forms through decomposition and mineralization. Macroorganisms such as centipedes, millipedes, earthworms, grasshoppers, and others consume freshly dropped plant debris and convert it into partially decomposed material, which is then further decomposed by microorganisms, mostly bacteria and fungi, into an array of compounds such as carbohydrates, lignins, fats, resins, and proteins. Mineralization eventually breaks these compounds down further into simple products such as carbon dioxide, water, salts, and minerals. Humus is what is left of the organic material after mineralization, and it's an essential component of healthy soils that you won't find in industrial soils. Industrial agriculture breaks this important cycle of soil health by repeated tillage and spraying with biocides that kill all the good life just described, as well as by trying to mimic mineralization by applying chemical fertilizers to lifeless soil. Next slide, please. Indigenous peoples, peasants, and local communities continue to be the world's best stewards for seed, maintaining locally adapted varieties along with the traditional knowledge of how to cultivate and store them for thousands of years. Globally, there are over 382,000 species of vascular plants, out of which a little over 6,000 have been cultivated for food. Of these, fewer than 200 species had significant production levels globally, with only 9 accounting for over 66% of what's eaten: sugarcane, maize, rice, wheat, potatoes, soybeans, oil palm fruit, sugar beet, and cassava. Next slide, please. For millennia, animals have been an essential part of healthy agricultural systems, and indeed all ecosystems on Earth. They transform plant biomass. There should be another picture, I think, if you hit biomass into animal biomass, which is eventually cycled back to plants in the form of nutrient-rich waste and once living organic matter. When managed responsibly, livestock improve soil health and contribute to carbon sequestration. They help control erosion by improving the quality of vegetative cover, and they promote the conservation of agrobiodiversity. Industrial agriculture, as you see in the right-hand photo, has constantly narrowed the number of species and breeds of animals with devastating consequences, as discussed earlier. Next slide, please. On our farm here in Judgewurrung country, in the Central Highlands of Victoria in Australia, we raise heritage breed large black pigs and speckle-line cattle on pasture and transform carcasses into a range of fresh cuts, small goods, and charcuterie in our on-farm butcher shop. Bones that remain after we've processed them into broth are pyrolyzed in a bone char, which is the what you can see with the fire coming out of it in the lower photo here. My husband builds everything on the property from second-hand materials, including old tanks that have made that retort to make the bone char, which is then activated in barrels of microbially rich biofertilizer and used to grow our small commercial crop of heritage variety garlic, as well as a diverse range of vegetables that feed the community here on our farm. We're a community-supported agriculture farm, or CSA, so nearly all our meat goes to 80 households who are members of the farm. They commit to a minimum of 1 year in a solidarity economy, sharing the risks as well as the delicious rewards of the farm. We describe the farm as paddock to paddock rather than paddock to plate, because nutrients are fully recycled on farm and inputs are minimal and from sustainable sources. Like millions of other smallholders around the world, we're maintaining biodiversity at the genetic, species, and ecosystem levels. Living a life made in common with nature, we conserve and sustainably use the biodiversity in our care And as non-Indigenous Australians, we share the benefits of our use with the First Peoples. Next slide, please. Place-based solutions are local solutions. They solve problems in the places where they occur, hopefully before they occur. By shortening supply chains, we reduce emissions and increase resilience in the face of climate change and pandemics. Farmers are on it. They're building infrastructure and taking control back into community hands. We're currently working on a small-scale abattoir project here for our farm. But there are several policy barriers to this work to relocalize food and agriculture systems. Land use planning, food safety regulations, and overly zealous risk management regimes at places like local transfer stations or rubbish tips are key priorities for reform to support farmers in their place-based efforts to mitigate and adapt to climate change and enact their custodial ethics. Next slide, please. The Australian Food Sovereignty Alliance recently established something we call the Agroecology Action Research Network. We assert that people and community should be the primary decision makers shaping our food and agriculture systems. We support and promote participatory research projects, such as the one I'm doing in my own PhD, to help us understand what is already working in agricultural communities, what is not, and what we can do differently. Next month, my husband my partner in farming and in life, and I commence a month-long agroecology roadshow, engaging with small-scale farmers up the east coast of Australia in a series of agrarian salons and campesino-style dialogues to support the agroecological transition in Australia. Next slide, please. The Australian Food Sovereignty Alliance has worked for 10 years in solidarity with the global food sovereignty movement to assert everyone's right to nutritious and culturally determined food, grown and distributed in ethical and ecologically sound ways, and our right to democratically determine our own food and agriculture systems. And we do this in several ways. First, like I said, we promote the sovereignty of First Peoples first. We promote fair and sustainable land and resource use. We grow CSA and other solidarity economies. We encourage biodiversity in wild and managed ecosystems. We support community control of the means of production in the forms of abattoirs and boning rooms and commercial kitchens and grain mills and dairy processing facilities. Reduce corporate control of food and agriculture systems. And as Maud was just speaking about, we fight corrupt water management, of which Australia has some very egregious examples. Next slide, please. I would just like to, again, thank Eva and Christine and the other organizers for bringing us all together to globalize the struggle and globalize hope, as we say in La Via Campesina. And I'm really looking forward to our panel discussion. Thank you very much.
Vielen herzlichen Dank, Tammi, für diese spannenden Ausführungen. Wir haben jetzt noch 10 Minuten Zeit bis zur Pause. Ich würde mit einer Anschlussfrage beginnen und dann hätten wir auch noch Zeit für Fragen hier aus dem Raum oder auch Fragen aus dem Chat. Tammi, als Australierin, welche Erfahrungen hast du mit der Wasserprivatisierung gemacht, die Maud als ein Beispiel gebracht hatte?
So, fortunately, because of the sort of farm that we are here, I'm not affected directly by the privatization of water because we have no need on our farm to purchase water. We have natural rainfall, so we are able to collect and store on the farm. However, I sit on something called the Mildura Community Water Bank. And what that is doing is it's a group of small-scale farmers supported by an activist up on the Murray River who have come together to purchase water allocations, or have donations of water allocations that they then hold in the community water bank, and it is then distributed fairly at a fair price to small-scale farmers who have lost that access. And I think it's one of the first such community actions in the country. And we're really hoping to see more of this because we don't know any other way to stop the control of water than to figure out ways to buy it back and then distribute it fairly amongst communities.
Ja, okay. Eine Anschlussfrage vielleicht noch, wenn noch keine Frage aus dem Chat oder hier im Raum ist. was hast du für Erfahrungen mit der Klimakrise gemacht? Australien war ja in den letzten Jahren immer wieder in den Schlagzeilen mit den Bränden zum Beispiel. Betrifft dich das auch vor Ort, wo du arbeitest?
Regarding fires, I'm again very lucky. While most of the East Coast was burning 18 months ago, our little place in the hills was quite safe. But I have many friends who lost their entire properties and their homes and their livestock, and it's a constant threat. We've been fortunate to not be in that area ourselves, but it could be us next year. Everybody in Australia lives in fear of either fire or floods.
Okay. Immer noch keine Fragen aus dem Chat oder hier aus dem Raum? Dann schließe ich noch mal mit einer weiteren Frage an. Du arbeitest ja auch im Projekt Pandemic Research for the People mit Rob Wallace zusammen und anderen und bist dort in der Arbeitsgruppe Agroecology. Welche Fragestellungen bearbeitet ihr in diesem Projekt?
So it's been quite diverse. I know that Rob and Alex spoke to you yesterday about our work on will industrial agriculture cause the next COVIDs? Because of course it will. And can agroecology get us out of that? Which is, that comes out of a dispatch that we published about 4 months ago. And the one after that was on land and conceptions of land. And it was a very good piece thinking about what land means in Indigenous cultures and what happens when we turn land into capital. And it reconfigures our entire relationship with land. And my own research is deeply tied to some of these questions about the custodial ethic and our relationship to land, because in Indigenous cultures, in Australian Indigenous culture in particular, I can speak to, land is law. And because we're all from land, we have an obligation to care for it. And when you have a relationship to land and rivers as siblings or aunties and uncles and parents, you can't treat them in the ways that we do in capitalist society. So that was the last dispatch. And now another comrade and I are starting to work on the question of the role of the state in disabling or enabling agroecological transitions. Again, that's part of my PhD. And we're currently engaged with the Convention on Biological Diversity's work towards the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. And we're watching the ways that different national governments are blocking genuine progress on how we can conserve biodiversity. And some countries' total blindness to the fact that if 60% of the world is held in agricultural lands, then the biodiversity on farms matters, not just biodiversity beyond the boundary of farms.
Ja. Danke. Jetzt gibt es eine Frage aus dem Chat. Und ich gebe an Christine.
Hello, Tammi. The question is, do you work with Keyline Design on planning the use of your property?
We did not use Keyline because we don't believe in tillage. So we follow it insofar as we do all of our planting and fencing on contour. And we will use sometimes animals along contour fence to help build like a swale, because we're on an old volcano and it's extremely steep. So slowing the movement of moisture through the landscape is something that we're trying to do by planting more trees and by having sort of low swales, if you like, on contour where those trees are planted. But we don't do any ripping or tilling anywhere on the farm.
Thank you.
Dann hätte ich noch eine Frage, was an den Vortrag von Devlin Kujek anschließt zum Thema Biosicherheit. Man sieht in dem Film zu deiner Farm, die du auf deiner Seite hast, sehr schön, dass deine Tiere vollständig frei herumlaufen. Hast du Sorgen, dass es Kontakt zu Wildtieren geben könnte? Das ist ja zumeist das öffentliche Narrativ, die Wildtiere sind das Problem. Wenn die Tiere Kontakt haben, dann gibt es Übertragung von Krankheiten.
No, we're not worried about that, really. The farm, while the animals are free range, obviously there are boundary fences, but the foxes or other wildlife can still come through the farm. It is fenced in such a way that if there were wild around, they could not get onto the farm because of our boundary fencing. And they would be the only more genuine biosecurity risk for us. The bigger risk would be if somebody from an intensive pig farm came to our farm and brought the diseases from the sheds. That's a much bigger risk than healthy wildlife in a healthy ecosystem. So the only biosecurity measure we have in place is we don't have people come here from sheds of pigs. And even if they come from another free range farm like ours, we ask them to change their boots before we go back to the paddocks.
Okay. Ja. Das heißt, es gibt aber auch keine staatlichen Auflagen für dich als Kleinbäuerin im Bereich der Tierhaltung. Wir kennen inzwischen auch aus Europa zum Beispiel Beispiele aus Frankreich, eben Biosicherheitsauflagen, die Kleinbäuerinnen in Frankreich massiv unter Druck setzen.
So they expect us to be managing our biosecurity safely, but at the size that we are. In fact, one of the wins that we've had for food sovereignty, particularly in the state that I live in, is we had some of the land use controls changed to acknowledge the lower risk of systems like ours. So we're not subject to the same restrictions and regulations as the sheds are. We were until 2018, but we got this change to acknowledge that the risk profile of a farm like this is totally different.
Okay. Es gibt eine Frage noch aus dem Chat.
Yes, I have another question, actually 3. The first one, what about wild birds? We were talking about the animals coming in before, and you said, yeah, so what about the wild birds?
There are lots of them, like quite a lot of them. And we've been noticing in the last couple of days, it's funny you ask, because they're having a change of season, just this beautiful resurgence of birds everywhere. I think a flock of maybe 500 white cockatoos went over us this afternoon, and the sulfur-crested black cockatoos are everywhere, and the grey shrike thrushes are everywhere, and the place is alive with birds, and we welcome them. We think it's fabulous.
Excellent. Probably the question came from the fact that here in Switzerland, because of the bird flu, they made this restriction that chickens should be all inside or in, in greenhouses, etc. The next question is, do you feel supported in the promotion of agroecology? Do you feel supported in the promotion the agroecology approach to farming by Australian government?
Yes and no. So we have, we have federal government, we have state governments, and we have local governments. And most of the policy and funding support or difficulties for us happen with the state governments. So the federal government controls water policy, and for those who are reliant on water rights, then the federal government is a real problem and not supportive of agroecological farming at all. However, when it comes to things like food safety regulation or land use planning, most of this sits with the states. And here in Victoria, we have formed some very good relationships with our state government over the last 6 years, I guess, and actually won legislative reform. Off the back of winning those reforms, the then Minister for Agriculture announced a special series of grants, some money, for what they call artisanal agriculture. We call it agroecology. They call it artisanal because it sounds more capitalist, I think. So we have won a lot of favor here, but of course a change of government could change all of that. But certainly we're enjoying support at the moment in this state. And we're working on that in some of the other states, but the larger states that export even more than Victoria are less friendly, shall we say, to small-scale family farming.
Somebody read on your thank you. Somebody read on your Instagram account that you are starting to plant wheat. As you just said, you do not want to plow. Are you direct seeding the grain?
Yes. So, did you see the photo? It's two little 12-meter rows. Well, and this year I'm doing 6 rows, and it's just for the wheat for making our bread here at home. And I have, actually one is triticale and one is a red wheat and one is a white wheat. And we build all of our garden beds, like we build them up with new organic material. We don't dig. And then we literally broadcast seed and then sprinkle a bit more soil on top of that. And then we cover that with straw. And then when we harvest, we knock it down at the bottom and let that rot and keep supporting the mycorrhizal fungi in the soil before we then come back with more material, drop more seeds and lay more soil. So yeah, if I was doing it at field level, I don't know how we would be able to do that in the same way, but this is really just to increase our self-sufficiency on the farm and the diversity of what we're growing.
That sounds great, thank you. And there is one more question here. Do you integrate local, indigenous or traditional knowledge? And if so, how do you do that? Are you in close exchange with the local First Nation people?
Increasingly, yes. It has been a very slow journey for us in our interactions with Australian Indigenous peoples. Because of understanding kinship structures and the ways that it's appropriate to relate, and learning how to go to local Indigenous groups with something to offer rather than just something to ask about them teaching us how to learn to do things the way they have. So it's been a slow process, but I think that we're getting much better at now, like I said, thinking about their epistemologies and ontologies, their very way of thinking and being in the world, and how we can do that in a more similar way, and also how we can respect and try to restore their sovereignty in land and life by things like paying some rent from our income that's gained by holding title to lands they don't hold title to. In terms of like actual traditional knowledge or traditional foods, in Australian culture, Indigenous culture, there's a whole protocols that must be gone through to gain permission to use somebody else's knowledge or their foods, and we respect that. And we're not seeking to grow any Indigenous foods here. We think that Indigenous people should be growing and sharing the benefits of growing Indigenous foods.
What are Indigenous foods?
So the main growth in this moment is around Indigenous grains. There's something called, well, there's murnong, which is like a yam daisy that they are working out how to grow at scale again. It used to grow, apparently before colonization, it would have grown across many, many fields, and it doesn't anymore. And then, of course, you have in the tropics things like citrus, finger limes, and we have kwandong, which is another, it doesn't grow here. Most of the things that can be grown for food are not well adapted for farming at scale. They're better in a culture that doesn't have too much population pressure trying to grow too much of it.